I'm not really good at staying behind podiums, but I promise I'll do my very best. Most of the time they're taller than me, so I don't like them very much. But I get a little excited about what I teach. And so keeping me penned up can sometimes be a little dangerous. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, super. I teach a 5-hour seminar on the genealogy of our Constitution, the understanding of why the Constitution is not a living, breathing document. Have you heard that?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a lie, and it's really okay for you to stand up and say it's a lie, because it is. History and facts both prove that the Constitution is not a living, breathing document. Our founding fathers were not winging it when they were putting it together. They weren't inventing anything. As a matter of fact, they tell us specifically they were not inventing anything. They were carrying on their own heritage. John Adams said in 1765, "It's liberty that must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker." How many of you have heard of a principle called natural law? Well, if you understand that principle, then, or you've heard of it, you've heard of a man named John Locke. But you know that John Locke did not invent natural law. Natural law was invented in the garden when God breathed life into Adam, because the natural law teaches us. Is this too loud? I can step
No,
back.
it's good.
I'm very loud. I might just get so excited I get a little bit louder. We are created in the image of God. And because we are created in the image of God, we've inherited certain things from God. God is the most ultimate free being in the universe. Anybody wake up this morning and tell God how to run things? No, I like to sometimes, but he still does what's best, right? Good thing, too, because I really mess it up. Well, we've inherited that freedom, not the power. And certainly not the wisdom how to deal with that freedom, but we have inherited that freedom. Problem is, we don't have a proper perspective on that in this country anymore. We hear people crying, freedom, 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 this, freedom, that. We don't want to live in a nation that's purely free. We can't. Do you know why? Because if we live in a nation that's purely free, that means I'm free to lie. I'm free to rob and steal. I'm free to murder. I'm free to do whatever is right in my own mind, regardless of how that affects you. Does that sound like a place you want to live in?
No.
See, that's anarchy. But John Adams said that it's liberty that must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it, derived from our Maker. And God, in his ultimate wisdom, knowing that we cannot handle pure freedom, gave us moral law. You see, liberty and freedom are not synonymous. Liberty is actually freedom plus morality. That morality that says, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder. Sound familiar? You know the things the ACLU won't let you have in the schoolhouse or the courthouse anymore? You see, without that shared morality that our nation was built on, we live in a nation principled in anarchy. And that's why John Adams said it was liberty that must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. He continues and says, but if we had not, our fathers have bought and purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. There you have it in 1765, John Adams himself saying, I didn't invent this liberty thing. I didn't have to wing it. I didn't have to make it up as I was going along. My fathers purchased it for me. Now it's my turn to say life, fortune, sacred honor, and purchase it for ages and millions yet unborn. That's the pledge they took. That's the miracle in what they did. They weren't doing this for themselves. They weren't even doing this for their own children or their grandchildren. They literally said, and you will hear later, for ages and millions yet unborn. Now, as much as I'd like to keep you here until 2 in the morning and teach you my 5-hour seminar, I'm not going to do that today. I have been asked, however, to come here and specifically teach you about the principles of religious liberty. The principle of religious liberty that this nation was built on. And it is so fundamentally important to who we are. And it's so fundamentally ignored that I think we've forgotten who we are. And so in order for me to give you that, I sort of have to run through the history very briefly. Because the reality of it is, church history is history. You cannot separate yourself from the history of the church and have a good, accurate reflection of the history of the world. So what I want to show you is that tyranny always hates religious liberty. Always. So I want to set a stage for you here so that you can have the proper perspective of where our founders came from when they were giving us the nation that they gave us. And I'm going to give you a very bold statement, and I'm going to say it very boldly, without fear. Our nation was founded and built on a Judeo-Christian worldview. Period. No question. No debate. I say that like that because it's not a statement of hate. It is a statement of fact. There is no other worldview in this available to us that would give us a document, a nation built on fundamental principles that says all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. None. Buddhism wouldn't give you that. In Buddhism, life is suffering. You're not even entitled to be happy here. You have to leave here to attain real happiness. Hinduism would never give you that. Because in Hinduism, you're not even here. The whole world is an illusion. You don't attain reality until you leave here. Islam would not give you that. Because in Islam, not even all Muslims are created equal, much less all men. My goodness, in Islam, if you are not a Muslim, you don't even deserve to live. Not to mention the fact that throughout our founding documents, our founders cried out to the laws of nature and of nature's God, seeking divine protection and the justice of our just God. In Islam, it's a matter of blasphemy to think that God would come down from heaven and be involved in the daily lives of his people. There is no other worldview that would give you the liberty that we have. And it's a worldview that has been bought and paid for with the ease, the estates, the pleasure, and the blood of our founders for over 700 years. The history that I teach starts you back in 1041, but I'm just going to give you some very brief understanding so you understand what's going on. Because England at that time had the most complex form of government in all medieval times. They had their own common law system. But they had a king, a new king, who was a tyrant and didn't like England very much. And so he set about changing England into his homeland of Normandy by imposing foreign law and corrupting the courts and involving himself in the churches to enforce his laws and collect his arbitrary taxes. His name was William I. When William I died, a series of very interesting events occurred. Excuse me. Y'all don't have any humidity up here. And his fourth-born son, Henry I, takes the throne. It's a very interesting history. I love to teach it. It's not like you learned in school. You know, when history was boring. It's more like real-life TV these days, where people kill people to get the thrones and drama and intrigue. But to make this long story short, I want you to understand Henry has taken the throne, and he's done it by some very dishonest ways. So he has to make a promise to the people of England so that they'll accept him as king. And one of the promises that he makes is in the form of the 1100 Charter of Liberties, a promise that that he and the kings of the future will not be evil and oppressive. That's an amazing promise, isn't it? One of the very first provisions in this 1100 Charter of Liberties declares that the church shall be free from government intrusion. Novel idea, isn't it? Can you imagine? Almost 1,000 years ago, already understanding that government has no place in the church. Well, we have to fast forward now to 1200, when the most evil king that England has ever known is now on the throne. His name is John. And John is ignoring the 1100 Charter of Liberties. He's an oppressive taxation king, not because he's the king that invented income tax, because he is the one that brought income tax to England, but because now the church has decided to choose Stephen Langton to be their archbishop. And John says, you know what, I'm the king. I don't care who you pick. I don't like this guy. I'm going to pick somebody else. And the government gets involved in the church. You see, up until this time, John was actually murdering people for not paying their taxes. And that was not enough for the people to make them revolt. But when the government inserted themselves into the process of the church, the people said enough is enough. They revolted against John, bringing the second document, the Magna Carta, reminding him that the 1100 Charter of Liberties made a promise that he had to keep, that the government would be out of the church. Now, we need to fast forward again, because now Charles I is King of England. It's around 1620. He's going the same way as John and Henry and William before him. And the people have to stand again for their liberty, bringing the third document, the Petition of Right of 1628, declaring that liberty is the inherent possession of men and not the gift of government. We had such a grand awakening as a people, understanding that liberty is here and not here. That it's not something that you attain, but something that you're born with, that natural law that says by the nature of the fact that you are created in the image of God, you've inherited this liberty, it belongs to you, no man gives it to you, no man can take it away from you. Well, Charles signs the Petition of Right of 1628, but he doesn't believe it, goes back to business as usual, but this was such a great awakening for the people. They didn't allow him to remain a tyrant. They revolt against him again. They bring charges of treason against him, find him guilty, and sentence him to death, bringing the fourth document, which is the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance was such an amazing awakening for the people, because it said that the root of all mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design of subverting the fundamental laws and principles of government upon which the religion and justice of this kingdom are firmly established. They said, Charles, you're a tyrant, and your tyranny comes by design. We recognize it now, and we will not allow you to destroy the fundamental principles of our religion and our laws of this kingdom. And Charles lost his head. The last document in the genealogy of our Constitution, before we get to our Declaration and our Bill of Rights, and our Constitution itself, is the English Bill of Rights of 1689. This is the Constitution that our founders brought to this nation. Their document declaring that liberty is an inherent gift of God and not something the government possesses or controls. And it's the government that's been established, sound familiar? Instituted among men to secure the liberty. And when George III started acting the way of Charles and John and Henry and William. Our founders, like John Adams said, did not have to invent anything. They just followed the path that had laid before them. Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." Alexander Hamilton said that where experience is the oracle of truth, and its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred. They're telling us when history repeats itself, as it always does, you can trust that to be an indisputable fact. How many of you have heard that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it? Can I correct that statement just slightly for you? Because as believers, you know, there is nothing new under the sun. Right? Human nature never changes. History will always repeat itself. But those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And that's what we're doing. We're repeating the malignant and pernicious design that was identified in 1641, identified from learning the history of the people that came before them. And our malignant and pernicious design is the denial of that history for generations. We have not been taught the truth for over 100 years. And we are watching ourselves doomed in repeating the mistakes of our history. But, as our founders said, even the greatest persecution will always have a happy effect. Because at some point in time, because liberty is an inherent possession of men, those who are children of God will have an awakening. Because God will not let His gift sleep within us. Let me explain to you how I know this has happened. I believe you are here today because at some point in time, I don't know, maybe 3 days ago, maybe 3 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, you woke up one day and said, "You know what? Something's wrong." You watched the news. You heard something on the television. You read something in the newspaper. Your friend said something to you about something that's going on in the government. And you said, "Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right to me." And whatever that one thing was, it nagged at you. And nagged at you and nagged at you until you discovered what it was and you learned what you needed to learn, or you associated yourself with people that would put you in the right direction of figuring out what exactly went wrong. And I'll submit to you, I'll suggest to you that you did not, no one told you something was wrong. You knew it. Because if someone had simply told you something was wrong, you could have ignored it. It was not here. It was here. And that's why you could never break away from it. That, ladies and gentlemen, I believe, is the proof that liberty is inherent in your soul and not something that has to be learned. And that's what we're having here in this nation, because persecution awakens the soul and makes us realize that we have a gift that we must stand for. And I'm here specifically to talk to you about the history of the First Amendment. You see, religious liberty is one of those Judeo-Christian worldviews. A liberty that comes by no other. Because only in a Judeo-Christian worldview are you free to believe or not to believe. You see, when it came time to ratify our Constitution, there was a large group of individuals who believed that this was not going to work. The Constitution by itself would not protect liberty sufficiently. They knew that they had to have something more, and they were fighting for a Bill of Rights. There were two camps. One group who felt that incorporating a Bill of Rights would actually be dangerous. Alexander Hamilton said this in Federalist Papers 84. He says, "I go further and affirm that bills of rights, in the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers which are not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why should we declare that the liberty of the press shall not be restrained, when no power is given by which restrictions may be imposed?" You see, our founders in the Constitution established a limited federal government. They gave them 4 powers. I'm sorry, let me correct myself. They delegated 4 powers: war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. James Madison said, principally external objects. He went on to say, everything else belongs to the people through their states. Do you see any gaps in that statement? So according to James Madison and our founders that ratified this Constitution, if it wasn't war, if it wasn't peace, if it wasn't negotiations and foreign commerce, the federal government had no business in it. So Alexander Hamilton is saying to the people, we've already told them, these are the only 4 things they can do. So why do we need to tell them they can't do something else? He said, if we tell them they can't be involved in our religion, they can't be involved in our press, he said, men with the desire to usurp that liberty will say, with a semblance of reason, that it's illogical for the people to tell us that we can't touch this if they didn't mean for us to regulate it. I mean, after all, if we're not supposed to do something, we have to define what that is that we're not supposed to do so that we don't get in there and accidentally do it. And then you open the door for legislation to define religious liberty, to define speech and press and assembly. He said, that will be the destruction of your liberty. We don't need that. He actually goes on to say, remember the genealogy that I told you, the 5 documents in this Federalist Papers 84? We don't need a Bill of Rights because these documents, the ones that I told you about, establish a principle that are already our Bill of Rights. We have incorporated those principles into our Constitution. Well, there was another camp that said that if we do not have these Bill of Rights, the people will fall asleep and forget their liberty. There's a founding father by the name of Richard Henry Lee. Many historians, and I agree with this as well, believe that he was the writer of some letters called Letters from a Federalist Farmer. He has a very snarky sense of humor, and when you read his writing in the Federalist Papers, Federal Farmer letters, you can't hardly deny that they are the same person. Very dry, very unique. But he says this. He says, although the amendments recommended will tend to guard and direct the administration. Now, he's talking about the Constitution itself, not the Bill of Rights. There will be a danger that the people, after the system shall be adopted, will become inattentive to their amendments. We'll forget. We won't pay any attention. Their attention is now awake. The discussion of the subject, which has already taken place, has had a happy effect. It has called forth the able advocates of liberty and tends to renew in the minds of the people their true republican jealousy and vigilance, the strongest guard against the abuse of power. But the vigilance of the people is not sufficiently constant to be depended upon. Amen goes right there, right? Fortunate it is for the body of people that if they can continue attentive to their liberties long enough to erect for them a temple and constitutional barriers for their permanent security, he's talking now about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights become visible boundaries, constantly seen by all. They serve as sentinels for the people at all times. And this is the key. He says, especially in those unavoidable intervals of inattention. He knew his history, and he knew that people would become pacified in prosperity, lazy in luxury. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll of the people in Florida and asked them to name all 5 protections in the First Amendment. There are 5 individual protections in the First Amendment. He found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. I ask you, if you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? That's why this is so fundamentally important. And our founders specifically thought our Bill of Rights was birthed out of the battle for religious liberty. How many of you have heard that the Pilgrims and the Quakers, the Puritans, came here for religious liberty, came to this continent for religious liberty? Okay? That's almost true. Almost. The real truth of the matter is, Charles I was King of England. Remember, we've already sort of touched the fact that he was a tyrant. And he was making these people take oaths, which was against their religion. And he was torturing them to do it. He was not only torturing them to take an oath, but torturing them to incriminate other believers so he could torture them too. They left here so that they could practice their religion without persecution. And what they did was they came over and created governments in the only way that they knew, that looked just like the one that they came from. Our colonies were established with charters, little government constitutions. And each charter established the religion of that charter, which meant that if you did not practice the religion of that charter, you could not have a church within that colony. You could not preach within that colony. You could not even hold office in government because they had these things incorporated in the charters called test acts that said in order to be a member of the government, you had to take an oath of loyalty to the religion of the charter. So if you were not of that charter, you couldn't take an oath, you couldn't be in the government, and you would never be able to change the religion of the charter. It was the perfect way to protect your religion. But that's not liberty. And there were groups that came over. The Baptist separatists were one of them who came over who had no charter to preach under. But they preached anyway. If you were interested in this history, look up a man by the name of Obadiah Holmes. Obadiah Holmes was a Baptist minister who was preaching in someone's home. They were having house church because they couldn't have church in a building. Someone turned them in. The constable came and knocked on the door, asked Mr. Holmes if he was preaching outside the charter. He said, "Yes, I am." He was arrested, thrown into jail, and beaten so severely that he literally had to spend an entire week on his hands and knees because there was no other way for him to find comfort on this soil. And so when it came time to ratify the Constitution, the Baptists stood up and said, in the Virginia Baptist General Convention, they pretty much had the power in Virginia, and said, Virginia will not ratify this Constitution unless there is incorporated a Bill of Rights that guarantees religious liberty. They said this: whether the new federal Constitution had now lately made its appearance in public, made sufficient provision for the secure enjoyment of religious liberty, on which it was agreed unanimously that, in the opinion of the General Committee, it did not. The Constitution by itself was not enough to guarantee that there would no longer be state-established or federal government-established religions. The leader of this group was a man by the name of John Leland. John Leland was the minister there, and they wanted him to be the delegate to Virginia for the ratification of the Constitution because they wanted him to fight for the Bill of Rights. Leland said, "Every man must give an account of himself to God. And therefore, every man ought to be at liberty to serve God in that way that he can best reconcile it to his conscience. If government can answer for individuals at that day of judgment, let men be controlled by it in religious matters. Otherwise, let men be free. You see, that's why our nation was built on a Judeo-Christian, how we know it was built on a Judeo-Christian worldview. We understand that it's that worldview that gives us the understanding of free will. The understanding as believers and knowing that we will stand before God one day and answer for what we've done and the things that we haven't done, if we've been disobedient to the commands of God. And what Leland was saying is, if the President of the United States can push me aside and say, stand over there, KrisAnne, I will stand before God for you on this day of judgment, and explain to God how you were only following my command. You were only doing what I told you to do, submitting yourself to the powers that were over you. And therefore, he can take out his judgment on me, and you can be acquitted, as it were. And Leland said that's not possible. We know that's not possible. The Bible does not teach that. The Bible says that that day will be personal. It will be individual, and no man will stand before you, save Jesus Christ. Well, it's that individual liberty, that responsibility that gives us pure religious freedom. Richard Henry Lee said, "It is true, we are not disposed to differ much at present about religion. But when we are making a constitution, it is hoped, for ages and millions yet unborn, why not establish the free exercise of religion as a part of the national compact?" Ages and millions not yet born. They were fighting for a nation, and I quote them by saying, whereas all could be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christian. Because if Christians know anything, you never get believers by the sword. You get people to follow you here, but not believe you here. And salvation is here, not here. Well, this was the driving force for our Bill of Rights. And so, how many of you have heard this principle of separation of church and state?
Nonsense.
Would you like to know the truth about it?
I know the truth.
Because I guarantee you haven't heard it in a very long time. The truth of the matter is, you cannot understand separation of powers, separation of church and state, until you've heard this history that you've just heard. You can't. It's impossible. Because what happens right after we ratify the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is a group of our founding fathers got together and tried to incorporate legislation, tried to pass a bill that would pay Christian teachers with tax dollars. Now let me give you my sort of legal disclaimer. I'm a lawyer. I like to do those things, so you give me a pardon for this. When I teach my 5-hour seminar, there are certain points in my seminar where I give you permission to be unhappy with me momentarily. Okay? This is one of those, but I want you to make sure that you listen to what I say, because I speak very plainly, and sometimes that makes you throw up the defenses. But there's a point to this. You see, there were a group of founders. One of them was Patrick Henry, whom I love very dear. But I think Alexander Hamilton would have described him as having an injudicious zeal. He was so passionate about everything that he did, sometimes he didn't think things all the way through. And they were pushing for the taxes to be collected to pay Christian teachers. And they said, and their opponents said, if we allow this to happen, this will be the destruction of religious liberty. They said that it is believed to be repugnant to the spirit of the gospel for the legislature thus to proceed in matters of religion. The holy author of our religion needs no such compulsive measures for the promotion of this cause. Remember, force does not create believers. That the gospel wants not the feeble arm of man for its support, that it has made, and will again through divine power make its way against all opposition, and that should the legislature assume the right of taxing the people for the support of the gospel, it will be destructive to religious liberty. Do you know why they said that? Let's look at this logically. If you pay someone with tax dollars, who is their employer? The government, right? Now, whose money are tax dollars?
Ours.
Okay, so, do you want the government to use your tax dollars in a sort of haphazard fashion in any way they see fit?
They do.
Just throwing it around? I mean, well, right. I mean, the way they're supposed to act, right? You want them to do that? I mean, no, none of us do, right? That's what we have to understand. Regulation is a good thing. Regulation is a necessary thing. It's corruption in regulation that's bad. Okay? Taxes are a good thing. You have to have taxes. Otherwise, you won't have a federal government that can engage in war, peace, negotiations, and foreign commerce. It's corruption in taxes that are bad. Okay? So what they said here was this. Remembering that when tax dollars pay someone, they become a government employee. Governments must regulate how they spend their money, otherwise they will be negligent or corrupt. And if the government pays Christian teachers, those Christian teachers will become government employees, and they will soon regulate what is taught, who is teaching, and how it is taught, when and where. They said this: whom the state employs in its service, it has a right and a duty to regulate and dictate to. It may judge and determine who shall preach, when and where they shall preach, and what they shall preach. So this is the point now. This is why I do not support voucher programs. Your voucher programs will turn every private school into a public school. I had someone get angry with me at a seminar and say, "What does that mean, KrisAnne? You're against school choice?" Well, of course not. But we have to recognize in this nation, we have school choice. This is not China, where our children are abducted at age 3 and forced to go to government schools. You can choose to send your child to a government school. You can choose to send your child to a public school. Or a private school. You can choose to homeschool your child. You have that choice. Do you know what our problem is? Priorities. We've forgotten that a child is an inheritance of the Lord. And they're given to us temporarily for our guardianship. But they're God's possession. And we are stewards over that gift. And that should come before 2 cars, 4 cell phones, cable TV, eating out 4 nights a week. We've lost, as parents, the sense of necessity to sacrifice in the name of our children's better education. And can I give you a cold, hard fact that I think you already know, but I want to say it out loud? If they take that tax money and hand it back to you in a voucher, do you think that they're going to stop paying the public schools that tax money? They're going to find another way to get it from you. They'll just double up on you somewhere else. And the only way we're going to take back our schools is if we take